Well, today I'm going to build a wooden countertop for a client at the Jersey Shore. But I thought it'd be fun to put the camera in the car and take a ride up to Vermont. Now, a few years ago, my wife and I bought an old farmhouse, and it really needed a lot of work. And I didn't want to spend a lot of money, so I did most of the work myself. And one of the ways I was able to save a good amount of money was to build my own countertop. Now, today's countertop is going to be a lot easier than this one, and that's really for two reasons. This countertop isn't going to have a sink, and also it's only 82 inches long as opposed to this one, which is just about 13 feet. So anyway, let's put the camera back in the car and drive back to the Jersey Shore. Okay, well, I'm back in my barn in New Jersey, and I guess that was a little bit corny, but I figured anybody who's thinking about building a wooden countertop might like to see that project. So anyway, back to this job. Right away, I want to mention the material that I'm using, and it's Sapele. And the reason why I'm using Sapele is it's very stable wood, and it's also very dense and will hold up to a lot. Now, another important fact to mention is that these boards are 5/4 by 8, and they're S4S. So they're surfaced on 4 sides. So if you don't have a joiner, this is a simple way to join boards together. Now, it's really important though that you take a good amount of time when you're at the lumberyard and inspect the edges of your boards, because if there's any damage to the edge of the board, you will not be able to get a nice tight seam when you join the boards together. So now that I've got all my boards laid out, let's join them together using the biscuit joiner. Now the first step is to line the boards up in the order that they're going to be joined and then label them. So I'll put an A, a B, C, and a D. And then I like to measure about 10 inches in from the edge of the boards and mark a line at 10 inches, and then put another line just about every other 10 inches. And those lines, or those marks, represent where I'm going to line up the biscuit joiner. Well, it seems like the popular opinion today with a lot of woodworkers is that they don't like biscuit joiners. And the only reason for that that I can think of is that sometimes a biscuit will have a tendency to telegraph through the wood. So, for example, if you were to look at a tabletop at a certain light, you actually might be able to see where the biscuits are. And the way I get around that is to set my biscuit joiner very deep. So basically, it's at the biscuit is at the very bottom of the countertop. So if it's going to telegraph anyway, it would maybe be visible through the bottom. But I don't have a problem with it, and it really just makes lining the boards up a lot easier. So I'm not ready to get rid of my biscuit joiner yet. With all the slots cut into the boards, I'm ready to glue the top together, and for that I'm using Elmer's wood glue. Well, I just finished clamping up the top, and I didn't take a lot of video because you really have to work fast and make sure you get all your clamps tight before the glue sets up. Now, the way I did this is I like to put my clamps on the bottom first and tighten them up a little bit, not too tight because you don't want the boards to pop or to spring out, and that would be a real mess. So basically I tighten them just a little bit to close up the boards and get a little bit of the glue to squeeze out. And then I put a clamp on the top on either end, and that will keep the boards from popping if you over tighten the bottom clamps. Now I say this in every video, or at least whenever I glue something up, and that is to try to get rid of most of the glue before it sets up. And in this case, I'm getting the bulk of the glue off with a sharp chisel, and then I'll come back with a wet rag and try to get the rest of it. You don't want to have to sand this glue because the glue will really gum up your sandpaper and make the sanding job a lot harder. Okay, well that'll do it for today. I'm gonna let the glue set up overnight, and then I'll come in tomorrow morning, unclamp the top, and start to sand. Okay, well I've already unclamped the top, or the countertop, and I flipped it over, so this is the bottom of the countertop, and there's a lot of dried glue, and I want to get the bulk of that glue off with a sharp chisel. Now you want to make sure that you wear glasses when you do this, because the glue will pop and it's very sharp and can hit you in the eye. With most of the glue removed from the bottom of the countertop, I'm going to sand it. Now, if you're wondering why I let the glue dry and set up, it's simply because the bottom was face down and I couldn't reach it. And again, no one's going to see the bottom, so I wasn't as concerned with it. Now, to flatten the bottom out so it sits nicely on the countertop, I'm going to sand across the grain. And the reason why I do that is I find the sandpaper cuts the wood faster by sanding across the grain. And you have to remember, this is the bottom of the countertop and no one's going to see it. I'm using a 4-inch wide belt sander with 80 grit sandpaper. Now notice how I'm not putting any pressure on the sander itself. It's just the weight of the sander and the grit of the sandpaper that's doing the work. Well, I finished sanding the bottom of the countertop and I've started to sand the top. Now I was hoping that I wouldn't have to use the belt sander on the top, and sometimes you don't need to when you're using S4S lumber, but there were a few imperfections that were just too much for the orbital sander. So anyway, I've already finished sanding across the grain, and now I'm going to sand with the grain, and then I'll switch over to the orbital sander and eventually finish sand the top with a palm sander. I'm finished with the belt sander, and now I'm switching over to the orbital sander, and I'm using 80 grit sandpaper. Well, I finished sanding with 80 grit sandpaper in the orbital sander, but then I thought, you know, before I finish sand the top, I'm going to bring it down to the job site and scribe it to the wall. And I didn't make a video on that, but just search scribe a countertop and you'll find something. Now that that's where that photograph is from, by the way. Now that I'm back in the wood shop, before I finish sand, I'm going to ease the edges of the countertop, and for that I'll use a roundover bit in the router. Okay, well I finally finished sanding the top, and I used 120 grit silicone carbide paper, and then I went down to 220 grit silicone carbide paper. And I really have a lot of time in this, probably a good hour just finished sanding. And that's what you have to put the time in, otherwise all the work is for nothing, because if you see scratches across the grain or swirls, it's just not a nice thing. So the next step is obviously to finish. And as soon as I make a video, or as soon as I get the video done for that, I'll put a link right here. Thanks for tuning in.